All right. So today on the show, by the way, welcome to New York Real Estate Show. Greg Helbeck here with Michael Pinter. We're going to talk about the ins and outs on the New York real estate contract. Before we get started, though, we are not attorneys. This is not legal advice. So the best takeaway you can get from the show before we even get started is to get a good real estate attorney, because if you don't have one, you're fucked. Would you agree, Michael?
Absolutely, 1000%. I mean, we could do a whole show just on stories of where our attorney saved our ass or where other attorneys made some stupid mistake that made us money.
Absolutely. And yeah, so you got to get a good attorney, but we're going to give you guys the ins and the outs on what to look out for, what does the process look like, and how you can sometimes get these contracts in your favor, even though it's a lot easier to do this in other areas. But if you know what you're doing, you listen to the show, it'll definitely help you out. So Michael, I want you to just start off with let's talk about the basic difference between the New York contract and how the contract process works versus the other areas. And then we'll get into kind of the weeds from there.
Right. So there's a huge difference between the way a real estate transaction and a contract takes place in New York versus the other 49 states. In the other 49 states, a real estate transaction takes place between a buyer and a seller. So a buyer and a seller agree on a price. The buyer usually whips out a contract, has the seller sign it, may or may not even give a deposit, or may give a deposit and the seller doesn't even
cash it.
Doesn't cash a check. That's common. And it's usually some minuscule amount, like $50, $10, $5, $1. And then you're in contract. So it's super easy to get into contract. And it's also super easy to get out of contract, which we've spoken about before. In New York, when a buyer and seller agree, the transaction really takes place between a seller's attorney and a buyer's attorney. Seller's attorney generates a contract. It's usually a standard contract. It's pretty long, 10, 11 pages, plus a rider and an addendum. And there's a lot of boilerplate language in there, which is designed to protect the seller mostly, because it's coming from the seller's attorney. And then the buyer's attorney looks at it and is going to start negotiating, and both trying to earn their exorbitant legal fees, sometimes over stupidity and sometimes over important things. But they're going to negotiate that. Now each one of them is going to be in touch with their client about these issues. So, for example, a seller's attorney will send the contract to my attorney, and it won't be, they'll say it's not assignable, right? Clause 26 in a New York State contract says no assignability. My attorney will go, hey, it's not assignable. What do we need to do? I say it needs to be assignable, right? Because I want the right to assign it. And then he'll go back to the seller and say he wants it assignable. Now, I'm taking out the fact that I've already had a conversation with the seller about that, but the seller's attorney is going to call his client and say, hey, this guy wants it assignable. Is that okay with you? In which case he'll probably say, I don't, if I didn't have a discussion with him, he may say, I don't even know what the hell you're talking about. But some attorneys will go, oh, this guy might flip the contract. But that's what takes place. So they're going to go back and forth. And that usually does not take a day or two. That can take a week or two, sometimes even more than a month. That's a long, stupid process. And none of that happens outside of New York. It's like you're instantly in contract. Yeah. But the only thing that's important here is that in most contracts in 49 states, there is an inspection contingency or some kind of other contingency clause that allows the buyer to exit the contract for the first 7 days, 14 days, 30 days. In New York, there's almost never an inspection contingency on a residential contract. It happens very commonly on a commercial contract, because you have to look at the leases and you have to look at all kinds of, if you have major tenants, you want to look at their financial viability, all that crap. It's typical. And of the bigger the deal, like $1 billion deal, they might have 6 months of due diligence. On a tiny little mixed use property, it might be 2 weeks of due diligence or a week. But on most residential contracts in New York, there is no due diligence and no inspection contingency. So the way it works in New York is when you agree on a price, the buyer then does an inspection immediately. Then before he's in contract, he's spending the $300. And if there are any repairs that he feels needs to be done, they're going to just add that into the contract in New York. So when you and I go into contract in New York, we have no contingencies. We have to either assign the contract or we have to close. Those are our only options. And what it does, if you think about it, and it's a little bit different, is it sets us apart from standard retail buyers, because we are certain to give them the money that we agree on. And on a regular seller to buyer contract in New York, there's going to be something called a mortgage contingency, which allows the buyer to get out of the contract if he gets denied for his mortgage. And I was in the mortgage business for 17 years. And I can tell you, it's really a get out of contract free card. You can use that. So there are plenty of sellers out there who have been burned by that. And when they'll sell to a cash buyers for less money than they might get if they listed it, because they know that there's certainty that we provide, because we're definitely going to have to give them the money that we agree on. That they're going to get that money from us. We have no way out of the contract unless there's a title problem.
Yeah, no, and you made a lot of good points there, because that is where, a lot of sellers and new investors they get tripped up, because they look at a contract, a 10-page boilerplate contract drafted by some attorney who has an extreme legal fee, and they get overwhelmed, and they think if they sign the contract, they're going to get shot if they don't close, or something crazy like that. So the biggest thing I would say when it comes to doing this systematically and not getting overwhelmed is, number one, you need to understand that in your worst case scenario in New York State, okay, depending on what earnest money you put down, if shit hits the fan and you don't want to close or you can't close, the only downside for you as a buyer is you have to be willing to lose the earnest money deposit, worst case scenario. That's it. You can't get sued or anything like that. Not legal advice, but I mean, that's the ultimate downside, correct?
You're 100% right. It's funny because as a buyer, your liability is limited to whatever deposit you agreed on and gave. Oh, and by the way, in New York, the contract, you're not considered in contract until the earnest money deposit actually hits the seller's attorney's account, right? You have to wire it or the check has to clear. So if they bounce a check, and I've had people bounce checks, I mean, most of the time by accident, technically you can get out of the contract and just say goodbye. But your liability is limited to that. But as a seller, if you don't want to sell to a buyer that you're in contract to in New York, they can sue you for specific performance for the entire purchase price. So you really, as a buyer, you have a very strong advantage, right? I have a deal. The guy just called me. I have a deal going on now where a couple of violations and permits showed up that they didn't know about. Now I'm in contract, and technically they cannot deliver the property to me with clear title, but I don't have to let them out of the contract. So I'm sort of negotiating for a price reduction at this point, because I have to now deal with the municipality that I don't want to deal with. But I have the upper hand, right? Because he can't just walk away from the contract. He can't get out, and I can keep him in contract for as long as I want, but I don't technically have to close. So there is a process where he can get out. If I won't perform, he can put me in time of the essence and say, we can't provide title, you can get out. But I pretty much have the upper hand, because I have time to figure out what's going on. There's a tenant in there. I think I'm going to go talk to the tenant finally and see if there's something I want to close on, and see how big of a price reduction I want because of the title problems.
You mentioned something earlier. That's an interesting story. What if someone's brand new to this and you just said time of the essence? I know what that is. You know what that is. What the heck is time of the essence? It sounds that like a magic play or something like that.
So as I said, it's super easy to get into contract in 49 states. It's also super easy to get out of contract. Basically, you call the guy and go, I'm out of contract. And there are ways as a buyer to protect yourself. You can record the contract in some cases.
That doesn't do shit. I tried that in Texas and I got.
You can record an affidavit of contract. You can record a memorandum of contract. In some cases, that'll help you, but it's not ironclad. But in New York, while it's a bitch to get into contract, there's no way out. But the way out of a contract, and people don't understand this, and I can't tell you how many real estate attorneys don't understand this either, because they very rarely have any conflict in the contract process. Basically, if you are a buyer, if you're one party to the contract, you can then send the other party a time of the essence letter, which says, listen, we're ready and willing to close. You have 30 days to perform. So it's typically done to a buyer by a seller saying, why aren't you buying my house? We're putting you in time of the essence, TOE, and you have to do it 30 days. What a lot of people who don't know what they're doing is they try to do it sooner. Like the on or about date is December 15th. On December 1st, they'll send them a 15-day time of the essence letter. You can easily reject it and just say it must be 30 days. But once that 30 days lapses, at that point, let's first take from the seller's perspective. If a seller sends a time of the essence letter to a buyer and the buyer does not close, and the buyer says, I'm not closing, the seller does have grounds to get out of contract and can move to take the deposit. It's not so simple. It's not a magic thing where the deposit just goes to the seller. Both parties have to agree. And once in a while you get an attorney who will agree, but you really shouldn't.
Yeah.
But that's now the other way. The buyer can put the seller in time of this, but it's very hard to actually force a seller to sell you a property. I have a situation now where I'm actually listing and the seller is just very, very difficult. And I told the buyer to put them in time of the essence. I don't think it did anything, but you basically time of the essence is telling the other party, I want to perform, right? If I'm a buyer, I want you to sell it to me. If I'm a seller, I want you to buy it from me. And that's really the only legal grounds to get out of contract is first using a time of the essence letter, or if there's a title issue, then you can just move to say, listen, you can't provide good title to me because I'm a buyer, or I can't provide good title to you as a seller, and then have both parties agree to get out of the contract. It's not a unilateral thing where one party decides, I found something better. There's a legal process to get out of contract in New York.
Yeah, and that has saved my butt a few times because I've done some stupid stuff and I've gotten into contract and I've had sellers try to cancel on me. And before we filed the list pendants, his attorney was like, the seller's attorney was like, this guy is not gonna go down. You have to close. And magically the next week we end up closing the deal. Because the thing is in New York, and this is why I really like New York. Well, there's many reasons, but one of the reasons is like, because attorneys are viewed from other gurus around the country as deal killers. In my opinion, when you know what you're doing and you understand how this process works, the attorneys are actually deal keepers. If you think about it, like really deeply, how many times has an attorney saved your ass where you almost got just destroyed? And
too many to count.
Oh my God. Yeah. We probably wouldn't be doing this podcast at that point. We'd probably be flipping fucking news on e-commerce at this point.
Right.
You know?
So what I've said many times is that if you're a buyer in New York and a seller decides, sorry, I don't want to sell to you, you can do two things that you just can't do in other places. Number one is you can file a list pendants on the property, which is the same as if you were a lender and a mortgage, you were foreclosing on a mortgage, which means he will never sell the property to anybody else until you remove the list pendants. That's number one. Number two is you can sue him for the entire purchase price and you will win. Now, when I say that to people, they go, well, how does a seller know that? And the answer is because the seller's attorney is going to tell him that, right? So you've had situations where a seller calls and says, I'm out of here, or I need another $20,000. I don't get upset at all. I just say, listen, speak to your attorney. And then I always get an answer that day, the next day, 2 days later saying, when can we close? Because there's no way out. There's just no legal way out in New York. And it's a huge, huge advantage of New York that I never even understood. When people would tell me, when I would go to like Investor Field, the mastermind that we're part of, and people would say, well, I have to be careful. I have to record my contracts to make sure the guy sells to me. I don't understand what they were talking about because I didn't really understand how real estate was done in other states. But we sort of take for granted some of the advantages of New York because sellers aren't getting out of contract if you don't want them to.
No, I had this happen in Texas one time. We got a spanking deal under contract and the seller got pissed and sold it to another buyer. And I was like causing problems. I was like telling the buyer, I'm like, go away. And he's like, well, and they ended up giving me $1,000 and I had their contract recorded and I was like, all right, whatever. But
right. So just to reiterate, so in other states, when you record the contract or an affidavit of contract, the idea is that you cloud title, but you're assuming that the new title company, if the guy tries to sell somebody else, is going to actually contact you. Some don't. And even if they do, and you say, I was going to make $20,000 on the deal, give me 15, and the guy doesn't want to do that, the new buyer, then the house will just sit there and nobody will, it's not going to get sold to anyone. So so there's a lot of ifs with that. I mean, it's probably good practice to do that because it can help you in certain situations, but it doesn't guarantee you anything.
No, and the title company, sometimes I've had this happen in Texas too, where some title companies are shady and they don't give a shit because it's like the Wild West out there. Like there's literally no rules in Texas in real estate. It's you can like sign a napkin and have a mansion. It just doesn't make sense. Seller finance and do a wraparound, which we'll talk about that in another podcast. But yeah, it's really, you don't feel secure until you have the money in your bank. But in New York, like when I get a banging deal under contract, like I'm going to buy this, this is going to work out, but another thing in New York that's different, and I think this is really important to mention on our show is, and then we're going to share a couple case studies and then we'll wrap at the end of the show. But, the typical contract is such a boilerplate, typical bullshit contract that, you'd fall asleep reading. When you want to put anything in the contract, when your attorney wants to put anything in the contract, you don't just like change contracts. You have to use this thing called a rider. I want you to explain to the audience what that is, because that rider is where you have all your leverage if you want your terms and conditions. And I can talk about after you explain what I like to put in these riders and what some of our friends do.
The rider goes after the contract, but riders supersede any of the language in the contract. So for example, I've had situations where I explained to the seller I needed a signable, And the guy left clause 26 in the contract, but he put a rider that said contract can be assignable, and that's okay, because if if both parties sign the rider, that supersedes the contract. And the rider is usually the bunch of things, and some attorneys have standard a dozen, 20 things they'll put in every rider, right?
Yeah.
And it's based on their experiences, right? So some guy had a problem with the washing machine, and he'll put something in there that says seller represents that the washing machine works, something stupid like that. So the rider really is just, it's sort of an addendum. It goes after the contract, but in New York law, and I think in law, all the states, but I'm not sure, it supersedes whatever's in the contract. So it's really important to read the riders.
Yeah. And the biggest thing that I would say if you're trying to get a contract in your favor as the buyer is, I like to do these three things. In the rider, I'll generally try to push for the assignment. If they don't want an assignment, if it's a good enough deal, I don't care. The biggest thing I look for is the deposit. I like to put $5,000 or less down when I can, usually anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000. That's you. I mean, sometimes I have to put more down, but most of the time I can get away with $5,000 or less. Usually it's like $1,000 or $2,000, $2,500. That has to go in the rider. And I've actually started to do this somewhat successfully as of recent. So maybe this would work for you out in Long Island, is if the seller is okay with it. And this like I said, it's starting to work, but has not worked in the past, is I'll actually get away. This is more in the rural areas in upstate New York, with a 14 business day inspection period. And I've pulled that off a few times this year in a rider that the attorney was okay with, which essentially was a get out of jail free card. And that has to go in a rider, because that's never going to be in a regular contract. So, and I'll tell people when you should do this. So if you have a deal that's like borderline, you don't know if it's really a deal, and you want to try to either buy it yourself by doing some homework and paying an inspector or whatever, or if you want to just try to wholesale it and you're upfront with the seller about that, it's a topic for another day. You get this rider in there if the attorney approves. And like I said, most of them won't, but some of these upstate hillbillies will. And you basically can get into contract. You still have to put a deposit down, but that rider can technically be a get out of jail free card. I actually have a friend, you know these people, we'll mention this offline. They have in their contract, not legal advice, by the way, they have the ability to put it on the MLS. They have the ability to market it for a fee, aka wholesale. So they have the crazy rider in there, and they get away with it most times. And it really opened my eyes up to like some of the deals I get into where I have to just take them down. So have you seen that on Long Island? I mean, that doesn't really happen that much, probably by you.
I really don't see it by me. And most of the guys, I mean, I haven't found a situation where I can get away with that low of a deposit by me, where, they're always asking for 10%, and I'm offering 10 to 20,000. And I can't get away usually of the with that inspection contingency. The people are, because the seller's attorney looks at it and goes, why the hell am I spending my precious time on something where the guy could just walk away in 10 days?
Yeah,
that's where I've gotten. I've tried it. It hasn't worked for me.
Yeah, this is more upstate. I'm talking like Ulster County, teeth are optional kind of areas, where like, the purchase price is like 100,000. You're like, all right, like I always tell this is how I frame it. I actually just did this twice this week on one was in Jersey, the other one was, I think it was Connecticut, but I was like, here's the deal, seller. If you want X price, I can potentially give you X price, and this is what I'm going to do. I'm in a need of 10 I'm always clear, 10 business days upon contract signing, period, where I can take some inspectors there if I want, potentially take a couple buyers there, and potentially sell this to another buyer and make a profit. Would you be okay with that? And some of them actually say yes. And that way, they kind of know what I'm doing. And that's worked a few times this year on deals that I wouldn't have closed on otherwise. But I mean, if you're in Suffolk County, Nassau County, that's going to be a little hard. Westchester County, good luck.
It's harder. It's harder.
But yeah, Ulster County, where the population's like 3 and they're all their cousins, they're usually like, yeah, just saw it.
Let's say less sophisticated.
Yes, to say the least. I mean, every time we get a deal in Westchester, I'm just like, oh gosh, here we go again. You got, very big balls.
$40,000 EMD.
Oh yeah, because the ARVs there are like 700. So like, I understand that, and even Rockland.
700 is like the slums of Westchester.
Well, yeah, it depends where you are. Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. There's like houses in like Scarsdale, and they're like $10 million. It's nuts.
For sure.
Crazy. So here's a I want to use a case study on something that's actually going on right now. It's not technically in contract, but it's the story's entertaining. The story's entertaining, and I think everyone will get some value, including yourself, Michael. So here's the deal. And I was waiting to say this on the air because it's pretty crazy. All right, so I bought a property just like you with a total knucklehead tenant, like idiot, moron, hasn't paid, has money, isn't willing to pay. So I don't even feel bad for them. And I got a pretty good deal on it. It's a condo. It's actually in Rockland County, so it's in a pretty expensive area. I buy this thing with hard money, and I'm like, okay, I'm going to have to get these people out one way or the other. Make them an offer. They don't want to leave. They don't want to leave. Their attorney engages me. Stop harassing my clients. I engage an attorney. We're like kind of going back and forth. There's 2 lawsuits going on with the previous owner, a judgment for back rent, and then a warrant for eviction that it's obviously been gridlocked since COVID. So I'm thinking to myself, this is like 2 weeks ago. I'm like, all right, well, here's the deal. I'm going to have to wait till January 15th. Well, I got to see what the law says. There's a court date in a couple weeks, but basically if this court date works out in the old landlord's favor, I'm good to go and they can get out and their COVID claims will be denied and we'll get the sheriff in there eventually. If that doesn't go in my favor, I'm going to have to wait and do a proper eviction non-payment. So I'm like, okay, I'm willing to wait. Okay. So this is my mindset. And, so 2 days ago, and this is like I'm not spiritual really, but this is like one of those universe things. So I was at a seller's house and they were so broke, they couldn't pay to even get the septic tank pumped out. And I'm like, I have interest in this property. Like I'm probably going to buy it. So they were like, well, we're taking $475 out of our savings account. It's like some of our last money to get the septic pumped out. And I'm like, that's smart, you know? So I'm on the phone with them 2 days ago and I'm like, here's the deal. I'm like, do you have Venmo? And she's like, yes. I'm like, I'm going to send you the money to get the septic pumped out. This is not a reciprocity play. Like, I know you guys are in a tough spot. I'll help you out. It's all good. Hopefully I'll buy the house, but if I don't, like this, here's my good deed to you. So I give her $475 on Venmo and she's all happy. So I get a call the next day, right? And this, and we have like an inspection, we have a septic inspection set up for this subject property. So like, we're just doing our homework to make sure it's a deal. So I get a call yesterday from an attorney. He calls my company. So he doesn't even call any of our marketing calls my company number, leaves a voicemail. And I'm like, I'm listening to it and I'm like, oh God, it's an attorney. Oh my gosh, am I getting sued? Oh my God. Usually they do it by the mail. So like, I'm thinking like, what's going on? So hey, I have someone who's interested in 164 Richard Court. And I'm like, what the fuck? So I call this guy right back and I'm like, hey, yeah, that's me. I'm the owner. How'd you find me, by the way? Like what, it's in all these LLCs. He's like, well, we did some homework. And he's like, I got a client who really wants a property in this condominium complex. They can't find anything. I know it's kind of creepy, but we found out that you own it and we want to buy it. And I'm like, well, okay, well, do you understand that there's like a non-performing tenant? And he's like, yeah, we know all that. We know exactly. I'm like, okay, this sounds like
he said he wanted to even with the tenant.
Yes. Yeah. And I tell this guy, I say, listen, I don't know you from Adam. You don't know me from Adam. I said, this sounds like a scam. And like, I don't know where like, I don't know what to tell you. And he's like, well,
you thought he was somebody that the tenant said.
Yeah. I'm thinking it's a scam or a lawsuit. I still have my guard up at this point. And he's like, well, they want the property. I said, okay, fair. He's like, what do you want to get rid of it for? And I offered, I'm offering him a premium. I'm like, oh, I want 200 for it. And this is like a 1-bed condo. It's not Beverly Hills over here. And they're like, what about 175? And I'm like, in my head, I'm like, hell yeah.
What price are you in for?
115. It's there's a spread there, and we there's no like, it's not on the MLS or anything. So I'm like, oh, let me just call you back. So we end up settling on 180. And I said, okay, here's the deal. I don't know if this is a scam or not. This is the deal. This is all the terms and conditions. Here's the rider. This is exactly what I need in here. And if your client is satisfied, we'll sell it to you. So John sent the contract out and apparently they're signing in a couple of days. So if it works out, that'll be like the luckiest thing ever. But here's the point to that story. I was very clear with that attorney on the contract, the rider, everything in there needs to be spelled out to the letter, because once you get into contract, once this guy gets into contract with me and if there was an error there, I'm at a disadvantage as a seller and he has me by the, what. So if you have crazy offers or you get lucky sometimes, you need to always review these contracts. Even if your attorney is getting paid, $2,000, you still need to take at least 35 seconds, if you have that time available, people listening, to make sure that everything in that contract is to your favor, because once they sign that thing and you sign that thing, you're done. You cannot change that. So you have to get in that habit of reviewing those contracts, because the last thing you want to do, especially as a seller, is sign a contract that could not be in your favor. I mean, have you had that happen, like where you were the seller and you signed something and you're like, you ended up kind of being weird?
Yeah, you want to hear something stupid that I did? So
Sure.
there was a period of time where my attorney, so the standard transaction from a seller to a buyer has language in it like that it's going to be delivered broom clean. Right. We go to a lot of
Oh,
properties.
yeah.
We go to properties that are far from broom clean, and we make it clear to the seller that they can leave whatever crap is there and they don't have to broom clean it. But when you assign a contract like that, the new buyer, the assignee takes your place. And if the seller is under the impression, because you told them that they don't have to clean the stuff out, but the contract says you do, then the buyer comes to you and says, I took your place. It's got to be broom clean. And the seller is telling you, I'm not getting broom clean. So that's happened to me a few times where I screwed it up. So I'm very clear now that I don't want that language in my contracts, because even on contracts where I thought I was going to close. So if you're going to close on that, you can then hold the seller and say, I'm not buying it until it's broom clean in theory. But if you had a conversation with the seller, you're going to be a jerk at that point. But I don't want that language in there, because if I assign it, I don't want the assignee, right, my cash buyer, coming back to me and going, I want you to deliver it the way the contract says. So it's something you got to be on top of. That happened to me, I think, twice. So
what did you end up doing? Hiring a bunch of guys to go
yeah,
clean it out?
I had to clean.
Yeah. That's the little nuances, especially on the assignments and stuff, where like you have to read them. And yeah, I mean, I didn't think I would be this knowledgeable on contracts, because I don't consider myself a detailed contract person or an attorney by any means, but I've definitely read my fair share of them now.
So once you get burned, like we have, you start realizing there's little things that it's worth spending a couple extra minutes to look it over.
Yeah. Due diligence is the key. I saw some Ben Franklin quote where it's like, the key to success is due diligence. And I'm like, man, that's so freaking true, because I've done so much dumb shit like during due diligence where I was like, fuck, I just can't get out of this now. Quick story real quick, and then we'll wrap. So my buddy, not going to mention his name, you know who he is. He just did like a gut renovation, like sick, Tariq Al Musa style flip. And I'm on the phone. We're actually going out tonight for Thanksgiving Eve. And I'm on the phone with this guy today, and he's like, I was telling him, I'm like, it was Devin. I'm like, listen, I'm like, dude, you got to get septic inspections. I said, dude, if you don't have like some sort of way, I'm like, you can just get washed out on these septic tanks. So he rehabs his house. Sells it.
Doesn't get a septic inspection.
Didn't get a septic inspection. The septic tank is absolutely obliterated. Like this thing is looks like a plumber's nightmare. And he's got to put a whole new septic system in now. The buyer walked away, and it's gonna be like 30 grand. And I'm like, bro, I mean, you gotta freaking get it. You at least get when they go there with the camera, just to know. So anyway, you got to do your homework on contracts, on properties, riders. This is especially if you're rehabbing, you have to know what you're doing.
Yeah, no, for sure. If there's septic, you got to do an inspection. If it's in New Jersey, you got to do a tank inspection. Like there are things in every location. You got to look for the things that could be big ticket items, because usually if you do that before you buy the property, you can get a reduction from the seller on it. But if you don't spend the time to do that due diligence, then it's all going to be on you. Like it's going to be
all on you.
On Devin.
Preferably before you're in contract. I mean, I get septic. I mean, I just did one where before we signed it, I spent $400, and I got a septic test, because I'm like, I cannot like really afford from a rehab perspective to have a septic be failing, because that's going to basically eat away most of the profit. So.
And by the way, it's disgusting also. Like I almost bought a house once where literally the septic was backing up into the backyard. There's sewage back there. And I'm like to the seller, do you realize what's going on there? The seller was out of state. It was a sibling living there. And he's like, I don't know. I have any idea. I go, this is like a $25,000 surprise. And yeah, it's gross. Septic is gross. It's really disgusting. Cesspools are gross. Septic's gross. Most of my area is sewers, but I do some septic areas. So you can't overlook that. It's too big. Too big a ticket. Too high of a dollar amount to say I'm gonna hope it's okay.
Yeah, and especially a retail buyer, like they're not going to negotiate. Like if the house is nice and there's a failing septic system, they don't care. They're not buying it. Like you're done. Like go fix it and move on, because
they would like their toilet to flush when they push the button.
Anyway, well, I hope everyone got value from today. I know they did if they want to get good at contracts. So like I said in the beginning, get a good attorney on your team. If you want a good attorney in the Hudson Valley, reach out to me. If you want a good attorney in Long Island, reach out to Michael. We know the best in the business. And I hope everyone, learned something today, and we'll talk to everyone on the next episode. And also, if you're listening to this, please leave a review, share it online, and we'll talk to everyone soon.